Hi everyone and welcome to Noisebusters. I first want to say a big thanks to all those people that have checked out our previous episodes. The feedback has been pretty amazing. What do you think, George? How do you think it's been going?
It's been great, yeah. Considering it was just me and you having a chat.
I know I couldn't quite believe that everyone was that interested in our little sad lives.
I wouldn't go as far as say it's everyone, but more people than I thought.
Everyone that I know, yeah. So, onto this episode, we will be touching on various elements around this person's career, but with a weighting towards aviation, really. George and I are chatting to James Trow. James is originally from Durham in the northeast of England. We won't hold it against him. He's the managing director of Noise Consultants Limited and is recognised in the UK as a leading expert in the management and assessment of aircraft noise. James has more than 17 years professional experience in environmental consultancy and has extensive experience in the field of environmental noise, working on large projects for infrastructure, requiring the development of modelling, monitoring approaches, along with detailed assessment and mitigation strategies. He has also had significant roles in strategic noise mapping and noise policy projects. James's wider project experience includes work across a range of sectors, including transport, energy, renewables, mining, planning, and also supporting UK Defence Infrastructure Organisation through the assessment of noise from various military facilities. Prior to establishing NCL in 2017, at the ripe old age of 34, he was a technical director at AMEC Foster Wheeler, where he led the noise and vibration aspects of a number of high-profile private and public sector projects. Prior to joining AMEC Foster Wheeler, James worked as an acoustic consultant at Hepworth Acoustics. So, hi James, how you doing?
Good, Dan. George, nice to be here.
Good stuff. So we just wanted to get you on to have a chat about your life, the way things are going, how you are, and kind of get that angle in. So I really want to dive in to the background stuff first of all, if that's all right.
Yeah, go ahead.
So how did you get into acoustics? What started it off and why did you choose the field in the first place?
Well, I think it was a realisation at the age of 16 that I wasn't going to be a professional musician. And I wasn't really going to be cut out for working for people like the BBC or in recording studios or things like that. So I kind of did what anybody would have done at the time and kind of had a bit of a sulk and then worked out that actually I was pretty good at maths and I was pretty good at physics. And after speaking to a few people at my sixth form college, it became clear that there was an option, and really through a process of elimination, it was acoustics that seemed to stand out on the UCAS guide. So I ended up applying for a number of courses across the country: Southampton, Essex, Surrey, and then Salford. And the course at Salford and Southampton were the only ones where they were pure acoustic courses. A lot of the other ones that I applied for were things like physics with acoustics, music with acoustics, and things went the way they needed to in my A levels, and I ended up on a acoustics degree at Salford, which was mainly driven by not wanting to be too far away from home in the end. But that's where I ended up.
Cool. So you undertook the pure acoustics course like I did at Salford. What are your memories of that course and what were your interests in that course specifically? What was the kind of key things you took away from that?
Well, the first year I was pretty bored, to be honest. Most of the maths and the physics bit were pretty easy. I didn't really feel all that challenged. And actually, I remember having a conversation with with one of the course lecturers at the time, saying, I think I might be on the wrong course here. I might want to move over to the physics course. And he kind of convinced me just to stick with it. And he actually let me sit in some of the year 2 lectures where it kind of began to become a bit more kind of, this is kind of what I want to do. And it was only really in the second year I began to get a bit of a feeling for, I've picked the right subject for me here. There was bits of work around recording studios, stuff about, how were you applying acoustics in different sectors, and where does it sit in the world of research and all this kind of stuff. So it was only really in the year 2 that I began to get a bit of handle on it. And when the experiment stuff started going on, I thought, yeah, this is the place, this is the degree, and it kind of all fell into place from there, really.
That's very interesting about the course, but tell me about the stuff that wasn't to do with the course. Tell me about your memories of Salford, because I spent a little bit of time at Salford. maybe for some people who've never heard of Salford.
Well, I mean, I'd hope that over the course of your podcasting series that there's a number of people from the university that participate and give possibly a more professional view of Salford. But at the time I went to Salford, it was going through a bit of a renovation. I'd come from a relatively leafy kind of suburban part of Durham, and when I got there, it was very built up. There was a mixture of people from different backgrounds, and my abiding memory was the first night I was there, and there was a ram raid on the cash machine in the ground floor of the building that I was actually living in through my first year. And we only knew about this because we heard the banging, and then about 5 minutes later, there was a police helicopter and armed police on the scene. So that was my first impression of the place. And there was a bit of reflection at the time, thinking, well, this course better be worth it. It brought you out of your comfort zone. I mean, one thing I would say about living in Salford for even 3 months is that it made you a bit more streetwise. It's certainly not like that anymore. When I go back, the place is a lot more tidy. The university's been renovated beyond belief compared to when I was there, and it feels a lot safer. That's for sure.
Yeah, so you worked in the industry for nearly 17 years. Has it been what you expected since you left university?
Well, I didn't really have many expectations when I was at university. I mean, the beginnings of my career came out of the back of doing industrial placement year, which got set up in towards the back end of my second year, and I ended up spending over a year at Hepworth Acoustics on an industrial placement. And that came about off the back of a number of knockbacks. And at the time, I was kind of thinking, well, I might just see my way all the way through to year 3. And I ended up going on this placement, met a guy called Simon Shilton and Peter Hepworth at Hepworth. And at the time, they were developing a noise mapping team, which back in 2003 was kind of a fresh thing. It was quite innovative. It was quite new. I'd always had a bit for computing as well, so it felt like a good fit for me, and I really enjoyed that year out, to the point where things went from being on industrial placement to doing kind of part-time stuff through my final year, them sponsoring my final year project, sponsoring me through my final year, and then going straight into a job at the end of my degree. And really, that's what kind of got my expectations of the industry, was that year out, because it was only really when I moved into that type of environment I got to see exactly all of the kind of applications acoustics can have in the real world. The stuff you see every day, the way buildings are designed, the way in which the streets are laid out the way they are, the way that roads end up in certain places, where aircraft fly in the sky, all those types of things. And in literally every aspect, there's somebody doing some acoustics or noise and vibration consultancy. So it was that formed my view of it. So I mean, has it been what I expected? Yes, because for the whole part, I've kind of worked in more or less all that stuff since I did my industrial placement. Yeah.
I thought that the industrial placement thing at Salford was probably one of the best things about the course. I think, like you say, it gives you that taster of different things. You could dive into anything. It wasn't just consultancy. It was loudspeaker design or all sorts of things they offered you to go into. But I think it's right. I think having that taster year, you also leave uni with a year experience above others that might be lacking in that department. So, yeah, I found it really useful as well. So if someone was considering working in acoustics, what would you recommend, in terms of how they would approach it, and would you recommend it to them?
I mean, I'd recommend a career in acoustics. I mean, I've had one so far that's been pretty good and quite satisfying, enjoyable. But I mean, the thing that acoustics offers is the ability to do a lot of different things in a lot of different places. When I mean places, I mean different types of work. One of the things you kind of got to ask yourself about acoustics is which bit of it do you think you're going to be in? I mean, there's architectural stuff, there's sound and video production stuff. There's the stuff that I do in noise and vibration consultancy. There's a whole range of it, and even within those specific bits, there's different niches that people go into. So I've kind of built a career on doing environmental noise. Some people build careers in vibration work and all sorts of things. So there's different bits you can go into and different topics you can specialize in. So I think the key really is trying to identify what interests you, because it's only better if there's an interest that kind of backs up what you're trying to do in your career as well. If you're interested in something, you're more likely to thrive. And I think that's the joy of acoustics really, is that you can probably find acoustics in whatever interest you have if you look hard enough.
I think that's a good point, because one of the things I like about acoustics is that people from a variety of backgrounds do it. It's not necessarily, people who've just done pure acoustics at university who've, decided at the age of 16 or whenever it was that that's what they want to do. People who've done physics, mechanical engineers, musicians, all these people thrive in the acoustics industry because everybody finds an aspect of it that suits their particular skill set, which also means that the people you work with it's quite an interesting array of people that you work with, because we're not all from the same engineering background, the same science background.
That's absolutely right. And there's people that we've worked with over the course of our careers who've come from marine biology backgrounds, or have got degrees in geography. They've come from different educational backgrounds, but they've ultimately had very good and very enjoyable careers in acoustics. So you don't have to do degrees to get into it. There's various post-graduate ways of getting into it and getting a qualification for it. But at the end of the day, there's nothing beats actually just getting on doing it, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, definitely. And you managed a team at an early age, James. I'm interested to hear, and I was there for some of it, but I wanted to describe what that was like for you and what kind of challenges you encountered. Like, you're quite young when you did it, so it must have been quite, a thing.
Specifically, the challenges when Dan was there. That's what I want to know.
I was going to say, trying to convince the management team to recruit you, during the middle of a recession was quite a success, really, and a challenge. But
so good. You see.
Well, you like to think you are, Dan, but anyway. It was challenging. I took the reins of a team before I even turned 30. And, at that time I'd got just over 5 years of, experience. And I think that the environment I got that role in was probably the biggest challenge, because you'd go to management meetings and the people who were around you would be, 15, 20 years your senior. And they'd be looking at you over the table and thinking, should you really be here? And certainly for the first 3 to 4 months of doing that role, there was a lot of challenging conversations that I had to have with people. A lot of kind of trying to, almost kind of justify why you got that position. So it wasn't easy, but at the end of the day, I think the reason I got that role in the first place was that I was able to kind of say to people, this is what I want this team to do, and this is how I want it to work, and this is what I think is the way in which, by making it work, will be best for that business. And it was really that vision and that ethos that got me that position. And it was only really after 6 months of taking that role that I think the challenges became more or less but they became easier challenges, because most people were kind of in the same way of thinking at that point. And you were able to you weren't telling people how to do their work. That was the other thing. when you're that young, you don't know everything. Taking on a role like that, you don't know everything technically. You don't know how somebody should approach a piece of work. You've not done public inquiries. You've not done this, that, and the other. So you can't go in there and say, now because I'm the manager, we're going to do it this way. You've just got to kind of essentially set out a range of values and principles you want people to do the work, and hear them out and make decisions that you think is going to advance things. So that was main challenges. But yeah, it difficult, but it was very rewarding. Certainly, the longer I went down, the more rewarding it was.
But I mean, I think the point to make is you're very lucky because you inherited such a talented team. I always think.
You're right. I mean, you can't have a good team without the people in the team being good people, and certainly the team that we had that was put together was a good team, and with a good range of backgrounds as well. They weren't all pure acousticians like myself. Some of them came from local authority like you, George, and you had people who'd been there for a long time and had come out of mining backgrounds and all sorts of things. So you had a good range of opinions, a good range of talents, good range of ways of thinking as well, and it worked very well. And I guess if anything, the one thing that I think I did bring to that team was to try and bring it all together, because it was quite fragmented at the time I took it on, and it did come together and it kind of moved on a bit. But that's really all I did.
I think a point to make about it as well is that it's a different kind of challenge as well. Managing a technical team is that I think I've mentioned this previously, is that people generally in the industry, I think, treat it as a career rather than a job. So you're less so managing people's drive, people not having a drive. It's basically, and you're less so, managing behavioural issues and stuff like that. It's more helping them technically and pointing them in the right direction. So it's a different kind of challenge, and it's probably a more rewarding kind of challenge, which I always think is interesting.
Oh, there's nothing better actually when you're managing people. And you try and, you can impart so much knowledge that you have onto them, but, then you've got to kind of let them, push themselves. If anything, you've got to make them work for themselves and be self-sufficient. And there's nothing better than seeing somebody who you've kind of got rolling, beginning to really get into a bit of a stride with what they do. That's very rewarding. And, that's one of the most enjoyable bits of it is, seeing people who you work with who come in maybe quite fresh, and then after 4 or 5 years getting to the point where they're more or less just able to do it with their eyes closed. I mean, that's brilliant.
So James, what advice would you give to someone to help them manage a team who wants to get in that position in their career but doesn't know how to get there?
I never really wanted to get that position. It kind of just fell on me, and it was kind of offered as a kind of, well, you could do it, or we could get somebody else to do it, and the thing might not look the same. So I would say if someone, I mean, I learned a lot doing it. I mean, that's for sure. And I mean, I learned more or less everything that I know now out of experience. I don't pretend to know everything either. But I would say that anybody who runs a technical team can do all the paperwork and stuff that comes with it. If you're working for a company or whatever, that's just part of the parcel. But you've got to have a kind of a plan for what you want from your technical team. And when I mean that, I don't mean like on a specific project or a specific type of work that you're doing. It's more of a kind of almost a kind of agreement between you and your team as to how you want them to approach things, how you want them to work. Challenging each other to do things in a better way than they do them at the moment. You've got to make it interesting. You can't just if you create an environment where just doing what they need to do to get something done is the way things go, then people will get bored pretty quickly, and you'll probably see people moving on. Even the good, the very good ones will go pretty quickly. You create an environment which allows them to find ways they can improve themselves or different ways to do things. and be supportive of that, then that tends to work very well in technical environments, because at the end of the day, the work that we do is the job. You have to do it. It's got to be done. There's things you have to do. But if you can make it just 10, 20% more interesting, then it'll pay you back. So that'd be my advice. Just try and make the working environment as interesting as possible for the people you're working with.
Are we talking like Google? Like, are we talking like ball pits and bars?
Bars, well,
ice
one
cream
of our
making
offices has a
machines.
bar, well, there was a suggestion of arcade machines, and I was, that's all good and fun and all that, but, I think if you're a technical person and you like your technical work, you don't want to be doing it the same way over and over again. You want to be looking at how you can improve it. I've always encouraged people to look at how they can do it better through programming or through software or whatever it may be. Looking to build applications that do the work more efficiently, because by doing that it gives them more time to do things that they want to do to improve themselves. So always been a strong advocate of people doing training or looking at what might be the next thing to do. Is there anything happening in the technological world that could apply to the way that we deliver work in acoustics? So I think it's that type of environment, and that's the type of environment I've always liked. And apart from a few I've encountered, it's a type of environment most acousticians tend to like as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've definitely noticed being around you, James, is that you're always striving to do things excellently, but also push boundaries and make people change and think about things differently, not just within your team, but in the industry, which is really infectious to see. It's just it's one of your good traits. It's just something that you seem to pass on to others as well. So in terms of project involvement, I know a little bit about what you've done over the career, but I really want to dig into what the highlights have been. What are the things you really look back on and go, yeah, that was cool? What things come to mind?
I mean, the first thing that stands out was when I did my first ever it was actually a road traffic noise project for a new link road. When I did it independently, and I kind of using mapping software and GIS techniques and stuff, and this was in 2004, and you think, and I look back at that now and I think we were doing stuff like the way people claim is the way that you should do it now, back coming up to 18 years ago. So sorry, 16 years ago. God count.
I was really good at maths.
Yeah. It might have been close logarithmically, I don't know, but anyway. But yeah, I mean, that was a standout. And then doing the first of the noise mapping projects with Simon Chilton was brilliant, and delivering those. I mean, that was a great time. That was literally 1 year of just, we have to make this work, we have to do this, we need to think of how to do it. And it was literally every week there was a new challenge, there was a new thing we had to do. And actually the first 6 months of it, probably the most enjoyable things I've done, because it was that challenging, and it just felt right up my street, and we were making lots of progress. And then the second half of it kind of petered out of it, because it was all about doing all the things over and over and over again that we'd worked out how to do. And then really the other things that spring to mind is, working on the Ministry of Defence projects for the RAF and the Army, and working on all of those. Some I can't probably talk to you about for reasons that are pretty clear, but getting involved in that side of things was just brilliant. And actually being able to go away and working with the Air Force, doing measurements of aircraft and modelling of it, and trying to work out how to reduce impacts from their operations. It was great, and to essentially become part of the team in doing all that, that was great. And then more recently working on things like Heathrow expansion, particularly around the airspace stuff, which I'm still quite involved in. Trying to work out how to do assessments of significant numbers of airspace designs rapidly, and understand which ones are the best and the better ones, the worst ones, and that kind of thing, and coming up with approaches to that. So most of the things that I look back and enjoy are the ones where I feel like I've been technically challenged, where I've felt there's got to be a solution here, we need to work out how to deliver a solution. I mean, that's that's been where I've enjoyed it. And I think a lot of the time it's been helped on the way by just meeting some really interesting people. And in all of those projects and experiences, I'll just recall, I mean, I've met some brilliant people and worked with some excellent people, cross-discipline as well. And that's the other thing about acoustics, which is always, kept me entertained, is you learn so much about different things. You're learning about how a train works one week, or how an aircraft works the next, or you're talking to somebody about how an incinerator is going to operate in the future. That type of thing. You learn about so many different things, and so if you've got a kind of a mind that you're interested about things and you're intrigued about things, it's a good career for that.
When you talked about the defence, the one thing that comes to mind and thing that George and I talk about and refer to a lot is when we were doing like measurements behind aircraft, and I think you sent us to do measurements of like a big C-17 thing, and it was, we nearly got blown away.
That was the Canadian Air Force, wasn't it? I think.
Yes,
they were the only ones that they were the only ones that would allow us to do it.
Yeah.
Well,
blowing past us and stuff.
There's not many. There's again, that's another part of it, of the job, is like convincing people to give you their aircraft for an afternoon so you can do some measurements of it and play with it, and being the first civilian on an A400M, that type of thing. It's that type of thing that makes it rewarding. But yeah, I mean, sending you guys to do a load of measurements at the back end of a military prop plane, that's quite amusing, really, isn't it? I don't know whether you got what you expected there or not.
If I remember rightly, the question was, Dan asked him, said, "Can I stand 50 meters behind the aircraft while you run the engines up?" And the guy said, "You can do, but I wouldn't recommend it." And so Dan was like, "All right, I'll do it then." And he was like, "I thought you were going to get blown away."
Yeah, I mean, if you want to turn yourself into FOD, that's a good way of doing it. I remember doing some measurements off the back of a C-130, and literally having to jump, behind two buildings to try and get something that resembled a decent measurement. And yeah, I mean, my recollection of that was just how cold it was, with the air. Literally, you could see your breath in the backwash off the plane. But yeah, there's lots of things. I mean, I've been and measured firing ranges on those military projects. I've been measuring tanks. I've been doing vibration monitoring of people tossing concrete barrels out the back of planes. There's stuff like that. I mean, that's probably somebody you want to get on this podcast to talk to, is somebody from the defence area, because that is a brilliant job.
Somebody retired, maybe.
Maybe, yes. We could maybe look for our contact books and find somebody. Find somebody who can answer those questions.
So, James, you've worked on some of the largest infrastructure projects, UK and I suppose internationally as well. For those who haven't worked on those kind of projects, what sort of was it? What was it like? What is it like working on that in that kind of role?
I'll not lie, it gets quite intense. A lot of the time those projects have very clear time frames. There's a lot of management and scrutiny of them, not just within the project itself, but externally. There's always people who are anti or for it, or, there's, legal challenges, and, a lot of the time the projects are run by the lawyers. So it can be quite an intense environment to work in on those projects, and you do tend to find yourself becoming part of the project. It's not something you end up being able to dabble in and just say, "Oh, I'm going to spend a couple of days this week on this," or I'll do this when somebody asks me to. You literally become part of it, and you become a cog in that machine. And when that machine is firing at all cylinders, you end up having to fire with all cylinders with it. It can be quite an intense thing, but it's usually rewarded by the fact that when you hit certain milestones on them, that you kind of share in the success of that. They're intense things.
One of the things that I'm aware of is that it's not just about the technical work. So somebody might think it's, it's an extremely difficult project. You must spend the whole time just doing on the technical side, but it's all those other attributes, the communication side, the engagement side, the project management side. It takes up so much of your time, and it's something that might not be apparent to somebody who hasn't worked on those kind of projects.
Yeah, I mean, you literally have to justify every minute you spend on something. You're constantly having to demonstrate that whatever you do complies with a policy, a piece of legislation, a piece of guidance. And it's pretty quickly how somebody can find grey areas in all of that, where if there's different ways you can do things, that you literally have to write your own justification for doing it. And the number of jobs I've worked on in those projects where you're ultimately trying to convince a lawyer at the end of the day that what we're going to do is the best way to do it with the situation that we're in, or the information we've got available to us, or whatever it may be. So you do find yourselves doing things that aren't necessarily the technical work, and that's good, because you end up learning and experiencing different sides of what it takes to get consents in the built environment. How do you get a consent for this? What are the rules around that? What does the regulation say about how you should assess something? You end up working cross-discipline as well, so talking to your counterparts in air quality, very interlinked subject with noise, landscape and visual, tranquility, biodiversity, and all these kinds of things. So you do tend to find yourself learning more and more about what other people need from a noise expert to do their work as well. So yeah, it's a very interesting environment.
But I suppose I'm interested, which of those aspects do you find most challenging, or did you, was it the technical side, or was it all the other activities, or is it?
The technical side of those hasn't been a problem, because you kind of, I think if you trust your judgment, you can defend whatever you do technically. The challenging bit really has always been in that type of role on those type of projects is the paperwork that goes along with it, and making sure that you follow the rules. There's a lot of rules about what you do, the way in which you write things. You have to write in a certain style. There's approved ways of doing your documents. There's document management processes. There's project management processes. There's commercial management aspects of it, which are challenging. Reviewing people's timesheets, making sure that people are spending their time at the right rates, that the scope matches what we're actually delivering, all of those sorts of things. So that is challenging, because at that point it's no longer really about what you're doing, it's about how you're doing it. And that's that's probably not my biggest strength, in all honesty, and it hasn't been, but it is something that you have to do. And if anything, if you've got weaknesses in those areas, it tends to get magnified on those types of projects.
Mm-hmm. So James, you're an expert in aviation noise, and you've worked for a majority of the airports in the UK. For those listening who haven't actually worked on aviation noise projects, can you briefly describe why noise is an important factor in the consideration of the operation of an airport?
It is literally because it's one of the few things that people genuinely notice about the way in which an airport operates. Even if you can't see the plane, most of the time you can see it. And the number of times you hear it, and how often and how loud is very much part of the equation that describes how annoyed somebody could be, or how sleep disturbed somebody could be. And that ultimately leads into effects such as sleep disturbance. And as we know from recent evidence, it leads to health effects. It's an important consideration, not just because people notice it and can be annoyed by it, but they can actually have their health damaged by it.
So James, a majority of the projects that you've worked on seem to be in relation to changes at an airport, like runway extensions, operation changes in aircraft types. In these kind of situations, what sort of considerations do you think need to be made in the assessment, mitigation, and the considerations for noise, really?
There's a lot to unpack out of that. I mean, I would start by saying that you need to understand what you think the potential impacts are going to be of whatever the development proposals happen to be. So get an idea of where you think the changes are going to occur, the magnitude of the changes, and then begin drilling into that, doing predictions, doing modelling ultimately to identify just what those magnitudes are going to be, the geospatial parts of the impact. And then get to the point where you're starting to look at what guidance and policy says. Does policy indicate, for example, that we need to provide noise insulation? Does it potentially indicate that there's a need to provide rehousing or the support towards moving people away from those areas? And ultimately looking at what the options for mitigation are. I mean, the mitigation options on airport developments depend mostly upon what the development actually is and what you can do. And the way, certainly in the UK, the way the systems are set up is there's different ways in which you can implement that mitigation. Some of it can be done through the planning system, some of it can be done through the airspace change process, some of it can be done through through voluntary agreements by the airport. So there's a range of ways in which you can do the mitigation. So the very early part of those projects, you need to begin to draft out your strategy for understanding and articulating the effects, how you're going to mitigate it, and then also being really clear with the developer about what they're going to have to do to put right any impacts that they have. So there's a lot to do, and the main issue with airport noise than any other type of environmental noise is you can't build fences, you can't put it in cuttings, you make it suddenly disappear from the sky. It's going to be there. So most of the things you can do are ultimately about the aircraft themselves and what they're doing or what's actually happening on the ground. So it's your options are more limited than they would be with other types of environmental noise.
It's a difficult beast, isn't it? And it's completely different to anything else you would probably deal with in the noise environment, just because of those mitigation constraints. You can't really do a lot, like you say, apart from manipulate the aircraft, change when they're flying. What seems to be the biggest issue you've found over the various airports you've worked with? What seems to be the most problematic source that you can't do much about? You have to think more about where it's placed. What seems to be the routine thing that's just a pain to deal with?
To be honest with you, the technical side of it, you can always find things you can do, and how influential they are, and just how much they end up being able to mitigate it. That comes down to what's possible. But the biggest challenge, really, certainly working on both sides of the fence, working for the developers and the local authorities and the regulators, like I do sometimes. It's the trust. It's the trust between the airports, the airlines, the regulators, and then ultimately the people who are affected by it is the general population, the communities. The people who sometimes claim to represent them in the form of campaign groups. It's if you can work for an airport developer and have all the best of intentions about how to go about mitigating the impacts of the development, but the trust between communities, campaign groups, the airports, it takes a lot to earn that, and it's very, very quickly broken and takes a long time to build back up. So we think that trust is a massive part of improving the way airport noise is managed. It's certainly one of the three kind of areas where we think there's a lot that could be done to improve attitudes towards aviation. There's certainly a role for the industry and the stakeholders in there to be looking at more transparent ways of presenting impacts, working with communities to help present those impacts in a way they better understand. We think that's entirely appropriate, because it is the one big issue that we face literally on every type of airport project.
Yeah, I think consultation has improved in recent years, especially in the UK. But I think there's still a lot more that could be done to make it more transparent. And when you say transparent, it's also kind of meaning that noise is a confusing thing. It's not very easily understandable to the layperson. So I think that's our difficulty when we're doing these sorts of things.
No, absolutely right. I mean, we do a lot of the policies are, in literally every country around the world are based around, an average amount of noise exposure from an airport operation. The people who live around the airport never experience that average. They can't relate to it. They find it difficult to understand how, they're being said they're not affected by it when it's based on some sort of average. So there's been a lot done to look at metrics which people better understand the way they're affected by it. The biggest challenge is that a lot of them don't tend to relate to the effects from the aircraft noise. They're more for communication purposes, and people will say, well, we need more research to show how some of these more communicative metrics and methods kind of relate to the impacts that people receive. And there's a lot to be done on that in my mind. And just looking at the ways that engagement takes place, there's been a lot of work over the last 12, 18 months to try and improve that. We've got new airspace change guidance, which takes a little bit of a step onwards. We've got advice coming from ICANN, the Independent Commission for Civil Aviation Noise, which again improves upon that. But there's still a long way to go, and it'd be great if there could be a consensus reached around, exactly what people should present when they're trying to articulate changes in aircraft noise.
I suppose I've got a question a bit about engagement. I mean, with your experience, where does the UK rank, would you say, internationally in terms of engagement on airport noise?
It's well beyond a lot of the places I've worked in. I mean, I've done work in places like Africa, Eastern Europe, North America, and the work that has to go on in the UK to evidence and communicate potential impacts, and particularly on the airspace change front now with the more recent guidance that's come from the CAA. It's a lot more involved than what it is in other countries. So I think we do have a more comprehensive way of doing it, but it's far from perfect. And in many ways, you're probably not going to find a perfect way of doing it. But what you can do is begin to understand local priorities. And I think that's one of the other things that we sometimes miss, is that we tend to focus too much around the generic guidance rather than looking at what really matters to people. And I think there is more that can be done around that.
So James, let's move away from aviation noise for a little bit. I suppose my question is that you've worked on some major noise mapping projects, involving transportation noise. Would you say that transportation noise is as big an issue as ever, or would you say largely that the mitigation and management measures that have been put in place have been largely successful? I know that's a bit of a loaded question, but
I mean, the noise mapping projects have been, principally driven off EU directives for a number of years. They've delivered maps of noise exposure across, the devolved administrations and England, and it gives us an idea of how many people are exposed to certain levels of noise. Whether there's been genuine action off the back of that is quite debatable, and the noise action plans that have been produced have very often just been tick boxing exercise, and I sometimes struggle to understand how much people have actually done off the back of those maps to try and reduce impacts, and whether mitigation is genuinely being derived off the back of the noise map. So I do wonder whether more emphasis needs to be placed on the noise action plans than the noise maps. I mean, I think going back to the first few rounds of them, I think there was very much a case of saying this is the technical challenge, is how do we produce these maps? How do we calculate every 10 metres across the country for all of these roads, gather the data, produce the models that do this, and you kind of get that far. And then you think, well, how are we actually going to deliver improvements in noise exposure from our major roads, major railways, and using these maps as a tool. And there arguably is a lot more work that could be done to make those things more meaningful. So I would say that it's a good tool. It's a tool that we should have, particularly when we're facing EU exit as well, and whether that's something that we want to continue doing afterwards. But the purpose of them, I think, needs to be rethought. And what do we want to get out of them? And I think, it'd be nice to see some very clear visions about what we want from strategic noise mapping and action planning. And if we don't do them, what's going to replace them, and what do we think is going to be the best way of putting a policy together that means that we're looking to improve the noise environment for those particularly who were exposed to the highest levels of road and railway noise.
I actually think they're really good thing, because I think the biggest problem is that people use them as absolutes. So they say that it represents this level at this place, and actually the power in them is that it demonstrates relative difference. So it's the same accuracy. Inaccuracies is the same inaccuracy exists, but they still show a relative difference between two positions. And actually, as well, I think we're finding that it has quite strong uses outside of the noise industry. So other disciplines find the information useful as well. I know James and myself spoke to an ecologist who actually they actually use strategic noise maps because it gives them sufficient information for the work that they do, historic environment work, all these other disciplines. I suppose, do you see that as being the future of strategic noise maps, or do you see as it being replaced with something else?
I wouldn't like to see the end of them. I might be saying that because I kind of enjoyed working on those jobs, but I think there's a bit of a shame in that as you kind of alluded to there, that the maps themselves and the things you can do with those maps, we haven't really scratched the surface of. We've got these maps across England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and have had them, for several years. But, all we've really been doing with them is counting the number of people and number of properties that are in certain bands. And also the scope of the maps means that you're kind of neglecting things that are becoming more important, such as the impact of noise on habitats and open spaces, recreational areas of outstanding natural beauty, and those types of things. So there's if we can change the scope of the maps and what we do, why do we have to map only certain things that the regulations say? Could we extend the extent to those maps? Could we then use the results of those maps to begin identifying whether we can start making relationships between noise exposure, things like productivity, access to open space, relatively quiet open space, make genuine research projects about how you could better design new garden cities and things like that by looking at experiences elsewhere, that type of thing. I think there's a lot more we can do with them than what we've essentially, under the regulations, are told what to do with them. So I think there's a lot more end users that can come from them than what we have been doing with them right now.
I think we have a lot more data as well. Maybe in the last 2 to 5 years, we've got a lot more health data available. A lot of people wear Fitbits, things are installed in their phones. We start to know a lot more about people's sleep disturbance if it's shared with us. So I think we're moving into this kind of big data age where we can start to have this data that we wished we had. We now kind of are in that precipice of getting to the point where we've got the data to make these things way more useful. In noise mapping, I find that the industrial stuff sometimes isn't representative, but I know we're talking about transportation, but I think the more we move to sharing data and people doing like individual industrial assessments, which is very much the case for those types of projects, can then share models with people that are doing the noise mapping, and then we can start to integrate models all together. We're kind of making assumptions on that sort of thing. So the more we share and have this data pool, I think the better these things will become. And I don't think they should go away. I think we should do a lot more of them because they are, I mean, transportation in terms of rail and road, they're quite accurate. They're pretty realistic in terms of the levels that we're getting out of them, even more than measurement in a lot of cases, just because we have a lot more variation due to met conditions and all sorts of things going on, COVID, etc. But I guess generally, in terms of noise assessment, do you think it will change a lot as we move in the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, I think noise assessment's going to evolve quite considerably. I mean, if you think back maybe 5 or 6 years ago, noise impact assessment was very much about decibels, and changes in those decibels, the levels of noise that people were getting. The whole thing's moving very much towards health endpoints. So, is this development, for example, going to result in a certain number of disability adjusted life years, or an increased risk of people having heart attacks, or whatever it might be? It'll end up a health, more of a health type assessment. So the noise assessment will ultimately become more of a health assessment. And certainly in England, you've got policies around health and quality of life, and quality of life is another thing which we need to do more on. It's not something that you can articulate just through a single number in a report. It's got a lot more wider circumstances. And I mean, in aviation, we're talking about aviation, but it does kind of set the pace for what you do in noise assessment terms, because it is one of the most controversial forms of environmental noise. And I mean, if you look at quality of life research at the moment, there was a very good lecture I tuned into a few weeks ago, which was saying, well, look, you've got these airports that have had significant reductions in noise because the operations have fallen off a cliff as a result of the pandemic. But actually, how do you begin to contextualize the noise component of quality of life when a number of people who live around the airport who are exposed to this reduction in noise may be losing their jobs because the airport's no longer able to sustain the staff pool that it has? The bus drivers aren't able to take people to and from the airport. All the shops aren't able to sell sandwiches to the workers, and these types of things. So I think beginning to understand noise in the context of that it's a consequence of what society is, and understanding it, and that's going to be a lot more part of the way in which we do our assessment work. And I think as well, the concept of soundscape is becoming an increasingly important part of the way we start thinking about proposals where there may be noise impacts, or there may be an ability to change the sound of a place that we're trying to develop. And again, that is something that we're starting to see in national policies here and there. And there's work that needs to be done to really begin to quantify and demonstrate how you would do assessments like that, and how you begin to inject those values of soundscaping into projects. But again, you can see that moving towards that as well. And then finally, you think about trying to articulate a project which may be controversial from a noise standpoint to somebody who's making a decision on it. Well, a PDF report is no longer really the best way of doing that. And you can see for a lot of the infrastructure projects, particularly the use of VR oralization and things like that to begin to communicate the effects. So you're saying, well, you might have a 1 or 2 dB increase, but what does that really mean? What does that mean for you if you're stood by the side of the road that's going to see that change? So there's that type of thing that's going to be more apparent. So yeah, it's going to change, and I can well see that the type of stuff that we do in 15 years' time is going to be somewhat different to what we do right now.
No, it's definitely interesting when you mentioned about quality of life, because whether you think people's sensitivity to quality of life has changed or whether they've become more aware of it, it's definitely changed. And I mean, one of the things that comes to mind is about this flexible working that's is being talked about a lot at the moment, and how that actually impacts on how we do our noise assessments, because quite a lot of time our noise assessments are structured in terms of concentrating sensitivity over certain periods and in certain areas. And by changing how people work, when they work, where they work, I think that will be something that will be more difficult to deal with in the future, because you won't be able to necessarily say when somebody's less sensitive to something. It'd be more difficult to judge what the average person would be doing at a certain time.
One good example of that is, siesta. In the middle of the day in Spain, it's arguably as sensitive as the night. And you could foresee that sort of situation occurring in this country with changes in patterns in behaviour, as you say. So it's not at the end of the day, that requires changes in policies and guidance and how you go about assessing that thing. And if there are cultural changes, then ultimately the way you have to assess things has to keep up with that.
I guess one of the changes that I thought of as a bit of fun to kind of end this kind of technical discussion is the kind of delivery drone aspect that always gets pushed around by, likes of Amazon, etc. Have you ever had any thoughts, James, about how we might manage and look at the impacts of those sorts of things?
Yes, I have. Just been part of an albeit failed attempt to get some research funding on that. But yeah, I mean, there are there is a drive. Certainly in the UK, there's a drive from government to be looking at making unmanned aerial vehicles, able to do those types of things, whether it be deliveries, whether it be supporting other activities that could be done more efficiently through the air. So that there is a drive towards it. As you can probably guess, they're not quiet. And, if you were to end up with a series of drone routes in the UK or anywhere, there's likely to be a noise impact from them. So it's something that needs to be looked at. I think it's one of these situations where I think you've got to ask policymakers, and because ultimately it is something that can only be driven from a government level, whether they want to understand what the potential implications and impacts of that type of thing are going to be now, or are they going to want to wait until that infrastructure is in place and those activities are happening and then deal with it, as a kind of an afterthought, So, my view would be that there's a need to look at it seriously, because it is something that's going to happen. There's certainly, as you mentioned before, Amazon are very keen on that type of thing, and indeed there are places where those tests are going on. So to at least be able to understand how people react to it is going to be quite important, because it's not like a normal aircraft, because most of the time these things are so small that you don't even know where they are. So you can hear them, but you can't see them. And they have a very distinct character to them, and a characteristic which has arguably got quite a few annoyance characteristics associated with it as well. So, you would want to do research on that. You would want to understand how it can be mitigated. You would want to understand whether there are limits on what should happen in that type of activity. Do you want to be sending 50 drones an hour over somebody's house? Is that a good thing? Is that something that people will be quite happy to let happen without any consultation on? It's all those things that we need to understand and get a handle of.
Yeah, I think the height of them flying is probably going to be one of the more challenging things, because you could, when you're talking about drone routes and stuff, they could fly similar routes to what the roads do or whatever, but they're flying a lot lower than aircraft, so it's going to be tough.
I think there's different types of drones, there's different types of rules around them as well. It is, you can see them, and again, I don't even know whether they are something that at the moment you could argue is something that falls under nuisance legislation, or if it's something that ends up falling under some sort of exemption from that. But my experience of them is that they have enough about them to become a potential, they're almost certainly going to be a noise issue of the future. In the same way that things like wind farms, air source heat pumps and that type of thing have become issues, noise issues, as technology has changed. So there is a genuine need to be looking at what could happen with that type of activity becoming routine.
Okay, so we've reached that part in the episode where we are going to crack a beer and discuss outline some of the news that's coming out. So here we go, guys. I hear an empty already, George.
No, that wasn't me. Who's that?
That was me. I'm off the beer, so I've got a Pepsi Max.
Pepsi Max.
What?
Living it to the max.
What have you got, Dan? Hold on, have a sip and see if I can guess what it is. Oh, lemon Fanta.
You got it.
Iced tea.
Blue WKD.
I've gone North American. See if you can guess what it is.
Coors.
Ooh, close.
Ooh.
Bud Light.
Ooh, even closer. Very close. Very warm.
What's that?
Budweiser.
Oh, right. Okay.
Bud Fat.
I had a joke about a brewery the other day, but I might not say it. Oh, go on. It was the three guys go into a pub, and one works for the Guinness factory, one works for Coors, and one works for Budweiser. And they go in, and the Budweiser guy orders a Budweiser, the Coors guy orders a Coors, and the guy from the Guinness factory orders water. And they go, "What the hell are you ordering water for?" And he goes, "Well, I thought we weren't drinking." So. Sorry.
How does that go down in North America, Dan?
Not well. Cool. Right, so let's dig into some topics. So I pulled up a few fun news articles. So the University of Plymouth has done a recent study and kind of thought on teleportation in live musical performance. So they're actually thinking this might be possible for doing high-tech jamming sessions through a blend of live human and computer-generated sounds coming together to form like a performance. What do you guys think about this?
What do you mean by teleportation?
It's basically like simulating people, you know what I mean? Not really teleportation. It's like they are playing together, so but remotely. So
well, I've seen them do. Can't you hire isn't it like Elton John or something? And it's like a projection of him, like running around the stage. You can have him for weddings and stuff.
Yeah, that's,
Is that something I just dreamt?
Is he coming to your wedding?
Yeah, well, I keep asking him.
So it's the the whole quantum thing for teleportation. So it's they're kind of instantly transmitting information over long distances. That's what they call teleportation. It's not in the way we think of in Star Trek and stuff like that.
So is this you plugging yourself down to play at people's weddings around the world?
Yeah, this is it. Yeah.
You, Jimmy Page.
Not worked yet.
Yeah, hologram Dan.
Elton John.
There you go.
Dan Clayton.
Hello, Dan.
So yeah, no, it's interesting. I thought that was something to share. People dig into that. There's another one which is about crabs, not in the way that George might think. It's ship noise leaves crabs too stressed to hide from danger. So apparently, the ocean is getting too loud even for crabs. So I don't know. What do you guys think about the crab situation?
James?
Well, I mean, I can't pretend that I know the ins and outs of how crabs work.
But you will anyway, because you're a consultant.
Well, all I know was there was an article, I'm sorry to go a little bit off topic, but it's relevant. There was an article in a paper the other day that said that a load of dolphins had reappeared off the coast of some country, and they thought that was a result of the fact that the shipping lanes weren't being used as much, and the noise in the shipping lanes had reduced to the point where the dolphins had felt safe enough to return back to where they were before. So I can see there's some sense in it. I mean, I don't know the mechanics of it, but it seems logical to me.
George, have you got any words of wisdom on the crabs?
No. I've been crabbing. So basically you're saying you're more likely to catch crabs
with a comb.
Oh dear me! Actually, that reminds me. Actually, a friend of Hannah's didn't realise he was messaging in a group chat in WhatsApp, and had asked about whether lotion and a comb was the suitable mitigation for crabs, but then quickly realised he'd messaged it to everybody he knew.
Yeah. Good use of the word mitigation there, George.
Yeah, friend. No, I'm actually asking the question.
Well, if anyone has any advice for George, leave them in the comments below or send us an email.
Basically, I'm saying, if you go crabbing, do you go crabbing in noisy places? That's basically, I would have thought that quiet harbours and stuff might be a better place to go catching crabs. But you're basically saying that they won't hide if it's noisy, so it's better to go in a noisy place.
Yeah, basically, yeah. So about half the crabs exposed to ship noise apparently didn't respond to any attack that was thrown at them, scouser, bird, anything like that. So they were too slow to hide themselves, basically. So yeah, crabbing in noisy environments seems to be the place to go, apparently. And then one final one that's kind of linked to James a little bit is NASA. Let's mention a bit about NASA. They are looking into approaches for modelling new aircraft and auralization techniques for aircraft that don't exist yet. So they're trying to model that sort of thing. And they're doing tests to try and simulate these things and see what they might sound like. So I think this is interesting because we're obviously not at the point yet, but we're moving towards electrification of transportation. So aviation is the thing that's hanging about in this kind of arena, but I know people are working on it. What do you think about this, James?
When the concepts around novel aircraft design have been out there for some time now. I mean, I've actually done a little bit of looking into how NASA do some of that modelling. They've got a software called AirNop and all sorts of things, but they are seriously looking at airframe design as being the next kind of revolution in aircraft noise and emissions performance. And you see these very interesting designs where people are literally sitting in the wings and the engines are on top of the plane. Kind of screening people on the ground from the noise from the engines by the plane itself in many ways. So it's there's a lot to be said for it. The airframe is becoming more important as well for noise. So anything that they can do to reduce that by looking at different ways of designing an aircraft, then go for it. Let's see what happens.
I think isn't the point that the fact that they're actually modelling the oralising the likely sound from the aircraft rather than doing the measurements that they do at the minute in terms of determining the sound power level of the aircraft.
Yeah, so they're using computer models, flight measurements, wind tunnel data, and they're kind of predicting the sonic characteristics of the aircraft. Yeah, so that's what they're doing.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, if you could, just let's say, hypothetically, if you could make an aircraft sound less like an aircraft and sound something a lot nicer. Let's say an aircraft passing you overhead sounded like a wave coming in at the beach. Would that be a lot more appealing?
You'd have a lot of people that needed the toilet the whole time, wouldn't you?
Well, if they drink as much as you do, then they would, yeah. But you can see that that type of character of the sound's going to be important going forward. And we all know it. If it's you can have the same level of dB, but how it sounds can be vital to perception. So let's see how far they go with it.
If you had an option, what would you make an aircraft sound like?
Well, I wouldn't want to say silent because then I'd be out of the game, would I?
Yes,
as loud as possible.
I don't know. I think if you could do anything just to soften it, if it wasn't as harsh, and the rise time of the event could be dragged out a little bit, maybe it could improve things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to say wave, like living in Alberta, we're kind of nowhere near the ocean, so hearing a wave, you'd be like, what the hell, is it a tsunami or something? You shitting yourself? It's just a plane. It's all right, guys. Stand down.
It's all right. But then again, there'd be a tsunami and everyone would be like, no, it's fine. It's a plane.
Everyone's grabbing their bucket and spade, running around. No, it's been great to have you on, James. Appreciate your time. And it's interesting to hear those kind of elements that you don't tend to talk about down the pub and stuff. So it's really appreciated that you've come and done this. So if you're watching the video, guys, put a like, a comment, and share the video. It's really appreciated. And we've got way more subscribers on YouTube than I ever thought we would do in like a few years of doing this. So I'm hoping that it's bringing value to you guys. So if you're listening on the podcast, it would be great if you rate the podcast, leave a review, and subscribe. And if you have a story that you want to share with, an interesting career or project that you're working on, then just email us at noisebustersdb@gmail.com and let us know, or speak to either George or myself on LinkedIn. There's a few people that have done that. So very excited to have Underwater Acoustics as our next episode. So stay tuned for that and tune in. So thanks, James, again.
Pleasure.
Thanks, George. And I guess we will see you next time.
Cheers.